Hey guys, it's Size. So, I've been a raid leader on and off for about the past four expansions, achieving cutting edge every single tier with a variety of guilds and different world ranks. And the one thing that I found is that regardless of the world rank of your guild or the caliber of the players, you can easily min max and help any guild achieve cutting edge, providing you find it's worth your time and those players are both respectful and appreciative. In this video, I wanted to go over the premise and the role of raid leading, as it's such a huge topic in the community that many people find a bit taboo to ask, or if a guild asks them to raid lead, they're a bit iffy about it. So I find either they feel they're too inexperienced or they lack the confidence to pull it off. So I thought putting together a little run through of my own experiences over the years and my own thought process regarding the role of raid leading and being able to dissect it a little bit as we go on. So without further ado, let's jump in. Now, specifically, what is raid leading? The term raid leader is widely used in World of Warcraft and other MMOs to describe the player in charge of a raid, a group of 10 to 30 players engaged in high-end PvE challenges, whether it be LFR, normal, heroic, or mythic. So this is the term that the community has created over the many years that the game has been out to assign a specific player or players this title. So why is it needed? Why do we need raid leaders? Well, whilst there are literally thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of guilds that get by doing PvE content without a raid leader, any guild that wants to effectively clear the current content in the time frame allocated, which is usually a few months before a new tier comes out, does have one, or has a variation of people that take up that role. So, why? Many of the PvE encounters that we talk about require 10 to 20 people to efficiently take down, and whilst everyone can focus on their own characters, spec, combat rotations, having an assigned individual who is able to call out mechanics or safe positions, mobility or moving, and essentially repositioning the whole raid, whilst the other 19 or 29 players can focus on doing the encounter and engaging in their damage, healing, tanking, and generally focusing on not dying, is a huge benefit to any community or any raiding guild that are looking to improve. And finally, we're going to be looking at what different types of raid leading are there. Well, this is a bit more of a broad question, but essentially, every raid leader does the same job. It can be done differently. From my own personal experience, I was the hand-holding raid leader who actively calls out every single ability and movement that is needed 5 to 10 seconds before it comes out. Some people refuse to do this, but I found that in the guilds that I was in, it was more beneficial to the team as a whole, and this way nobody had an excuse to not understand or to fail a mechanic due to not seeing it or not knowing it was coming in. So this worked well for me and the team that I had, but it might not be the same for everyone. There is also the more laid back approach, where the assigned raid leader assumes everybody understands the mechanics of the raid and that they have done their research beforehand, which some people think isn't a lot to ask, but you've got to understand some people that play World of Warcraft and raid literally have so many real life commitments that means they can literally log on when they get home from work at a certain time and they have to log off. You know, free time is very limited to people, especially this Asian population in World of Warcraft that are still raiding and still trying to compete at a high level. So this kind of raid leader will just make adjustments to the tactic as it goes on, and they will mainly call out the important abilities for people to be aware of, assuming that the tactic is known beforehand and that people know exactly where to stand and when to move. So this is a little bit more laid back, as I said. On top of this, we have recently seen a new style of the 21st man raid leader coming around in mythic content, which started showing itself to be more prevalent at the start of Shadowlands, from both Scripe from Eckham and Max from Liquid. I do know there were many guilds that did this beforehand, but as the community really focuses on the race to world first, this is generally the main two guilds and two individuals that have showed it on stream. So what happens is they sit out of the raid encounter and they manage the callouts from a Discord stream or TeamViewer, any other style of application. This gave them the opportunities to work at peak performance as a raid leader and min-maxing the raid as a whole, instead of physically having to be inside the raid and somewhat hindering via their own play, as it's hard for a raid leader to maintain performance on their character as well as focusing on the entire raid as a whole. This means that the raid can focus on damage, healing, tanking, and the raid leader's literally free to observe everything and generally call out things without having all that stress on top of surviving as well. I do imagine there are a plethora of other ways to raid lead, but these are the most common scenarios that I have faced and I've watched personally throughout the years. With that, I want to move on to dissecting the role of raid leader and what anybody that wants to do it should expect. Let's get into that. So, dissecting the role. Should you do it? That's a personal question that only you can answer. At the end of the day, if you feel confident that you know the encounters and you can perform whilst calling out the mechanics and actively picking up on a tactic you want to use, both in progress and in farm, go for it. However, you need to have the confidence factor. If you don't have the confidence in calling out mechanics or making decisions in a raid, you're going to fall behind. You're going to see the guild's progress and performance decline. You need to be confident in what you're saying, and people need to recognize that in your calls, recognize that in your decisions. But moving on, how can raid leading benefit you? Well, for one, it pretty much guarantees a raid spot the majority of the time. You are actively in a position to make positive changes to your guild and team, the tactics as a whole, especially if you deem it to be required. People care about your opinions. What you say has an impact on how the guild is built. So it means you can also have a say in who you take to the raid, depending on how they've been performing, and it allows you to have more of a say in the composition that you use for progression. So a lot of guilds, especially the lower world rank that you look, their players have a lot of ults. There's a lot of people that can play different classes, and whilst the comp isn't the be all end all of killing a boss, it helps out massively. There's certain classes that mean that a raid encounter is trivial. So for example, in this raid that we've been doing, evoker healers are carrying hard. So having two of them over having maybe two resto shamans or a resto druid and a holy paladin, having the option to play two evokers and you being able to make that call is a massive help to the raid. So, are there any cons? So yes, whilst you have the benefits I mentioned earlier, being able to make all the calls, people respecting your opinion, having a say in the comp, it's still a role with the potential for drama, headaches, and it requires a lot of prep outside the raid and the game. So as a whole, it can also be perceived as a thankless role, where you don't receive thanks or appreciation for the amount of time and effort you put in. But depending on the guild, that's not strictly true. If you feel like you're not being thanked for it, or you feel like you're not appreciated, then maybe it's time to move on to a guild that would appreciate it a little bit more. But it's completely up to you. And you have to accept that you're going to be spending a lot of time outside of the raid prepping for progress and farm, messing around with spreadsheets, picking up the compositions, being involved in trial interviews as well is another big thing. Because essentially, as a raid leader, when it comes to the raid encounters and the raid environment, you have the last say. Finally, a good UI. Every raid leader needs a UI that they're comfortable with, whether it's one that you've had for years. As long as you're comfortable with it and you are open to a little bit of change, it works fine. Personally, this is the UI that I use generally when raid leading. It'll show all external single targets and raid-wide cooldowns from the healers, as well as anti-magic zone for death knights. And especially on some fights, I do track Vortex and Typhoon, especially when there are adds that need to be kept in a certain location. But on top of that, I also have the mobility cooldowns, so that I can call for a Stampeding Roar or a Wind Rush on demand. It's extremely undervalued, and there's been times where this has saved the encounter, being able to move and reposition the raid to another area of the room. It's been extremely helpful. I also track individual players' defensives and health potions on the raid frames. I try to centralize this in order to make it so that my eyes don't have to move far from my character and I can focus on performing on my character and the performance of the raid, meaning that I can call things extremely easily. In addition to this, there are some add-ons and raid leading tools that I personally found extremely useful when engaging in raid leading. These are Bigwigs or DBM as boss mods. They track mechanics and abilities and give you a visual timer in the form of a bar, meaning you can plan ahead 2 to 4 abilities in advance, meaning that your calls can become quicker and people can plan accordingly. The majority of raiders have this or should have it as standard on top of weak auras. In recent times, weak auras have become insanely good. You can now track abilities, healers' mana, cooldowns, give warnings of an ability coming up, and add in custom sounds to them so you know something's happening. You can also have weak auras that deal with the entire abilities. So, for example, last expansion on Lords of Dread, there was an ability which meant that 2 people were imposters and you had to vote them out. The weak aura made it so that it wasn't called every single time. Players could see the ability on the player and click a button, and the one with the majority of the vote was more likely to be the individual that you had to kill. Without this, you would have had to communicate it verbally over Discord, TeamSpeak, and it would have got extremely cluttered. So, moving on from weak orders. Whilst Blizzard do occasionally break the overpowered weak orders in the past, the developers are still having so much fun in, making weak orders that work for guilds. Just seeing some of the weak orders that Echo and Liquid use blow my mind. But in addition to this, method raid tools, some of you may remember it as being Exhaustus raid tools, but it changed names. This allows you to track raid cooldowns, personals, mobility, combat reses, and it allows you to make and share notes on the raid encounter for your entire raid. Paired with some weak orders, you can have abilities ticking down on a timer as well. Extremely useful for healers. Outside of the game, you've got websites like Warcraft Logs, Wipefest, Raid Planner.io, and many more that help you with your role. Being able to copy tactics, check what wiped your raid, and improve generally as your own class, and sitting down with players after the raid and comparing their logs to another player's that maybe passed a little bit higher and seeing what they could do to improve as well. Extremely useful website. Wipefest allows you to see all of the same information as Warcraft Logs, but a bit more friendly to the eyes. If you don't have time to learn Warcraft Logs, although I would highly suggest it, Wipefest will do the same thing. It'll just look a little bit nicer and it's a little bit easier to navigate. Raid Planner.io gives you the map of the boss encounter room and allows you to place markers and groups where the tank's going to stand, where the healers are going to stand, before you even pull the boss. So this allows you to plan ahead accordingly, and these are incredibly useful. So, now that we've dissected the role a little bit and what you're expected to do and how it works generally, we're going to be looking at the expectations of a raid leader. So let's hop in. So, when starting out as a raid leader or coming into the role in a already formed guild, you have to set the tone. You have to sit down with the raiders and the officers and talk to them and explain what you expect from them respectfully, because the last thing you want is to come across as disrespectful, especially when this is the team you're going to be playing with and you want to mould. So laying out what you expect of them and the guild and your playtime as a whole is extremely important to do early on. You need to make sure that this aligns with what the guild wants though, because some guilds are happy staying where they are and some guilds actively want to improve. You just need to make sure that it's the right guild for you and the right environment for them. You also will have to make some hard decisions, such as usually having the final say on who makes it into a certain fight. If you don't like confrontation, this role also isn't really for you, because you're going to have to be benching individuals alongside failing trials and demoting raiders, but you do also have the upside of promoting trials and promoting raiders depending on their performance. Having the last say in that is really nice because your opinion matters. As a raid leader, you've got to be objective and you've got to look at what's going to benefit the guild the most moving forward. But if it's the right choice in terms of demoting people, then you have to decide whether or not you're putting the guild first or your own opinions. Because in the past, I've had to actively demote my friends, fail their trials, and bench them from fights. You know, the drama does come along with it, but I put the guild first and I made sure that the people that were right for the fight were in. You know, if people are underperforming, they need to be spoken to again respectfully, because people play this game not just as a hobby. Some people take it extremely seriously, and if they don't get told they're not performing well, chances are they haven't realised, and giving them a nudge in the right direction might be helpful. So I've also found that watching the Race to World first and joining raid leading Discord helped me out a lot. You know, before I jumped into the raid in my own guild, I'll be able to watch the Race to World first, see how they did the fight, gauge the difficulties, especially now that the raids aren't as linear. You know, you've got choices in which bosses to go to. So, you know, you've got Primal Council, Dathia, Kurog, Xenath, all of them you can just choose, right? It's nice to have the option. So, same applies for PTR and beta testing. You don't have to raid lead the encounters, but seeing them firsthand is a massive help. You know, it's extremely useful to see these fights and gauge what abilities are going to be important, what are hard hitting, and what are going to be a little bit easier to manage with. So with that, I'm going to finally move on to my personal experiences, and then we're going to end the video. Be right back. So, personal experience. In my personal experience, I found that World of Warcraft and real life both benefit each other. I've had management positions in my previous jobs, and it's helped me focus on managing a guild and running a guild. Understanding how to speak to people is the biggest thing. You know, being able to motivate them, either in work or on World of Warcraft. I understood that they both went hand in hand. You want to make use of your real life skills when taking on this role. You cannot go wrong by applying real life applications to the game. It's beneficial for you and the guild. And the same goes the other way around, right? Being able to plan ahead in real life and planning for the next day also went along with being able to plan for the next encounter, you know, the next raid. It's all about planning and making the most of your time. But you do have to accept that if you're picking up this role, it'll take out a lot of your personal time. And you have to find a right balance for you that works and feels comfortable. At the end of the day, this is just a game to some people, but those people value the time they have on it, and making sure that it's all working in tandem is very important. With that, guys, I want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate all of you watching. It's a bit of a different style of a video away from the Shadow Priest, but a lot of people have asked, especially people that have known me in game, and they've asked me, you know, my guild's asked me to raid lead and I'm not sure how to go about it. I just thought this would give you a bit of an insight into the role and give you a little bit of confidence now that you've seen the ins and outs of the role and what you can look to expect from it. Take care, guys.